All right, welcome everybody. This is episode 8 of the Tide Hoops History Summer Podcast Series. We did take a break last week. They had SEC Media Days going on, so a little difficult in some of the schedules we were trying to arrange. We are working on trying to finish with a bang. I don't want to spoil anything, but I'm working on some really good guests. But that does not diminish the two guests that we have today. This is a conversation I've been looking forward to a long time. For this episode, we've invited two long-standing radio personalities in the state of Alabama. First up, we have Doug Amos, host of the MAX Roundtable on ESPN The Ticket, 107.5 in Montgomery, and Drew DeArmond, host of Talkin Ball on ESPN The Zone on 97.7 in Huntsville. The good thing I'm going to say about inviting this, and I was joking, we're going to call this the Grumpy Old Men podcast, but between the three of us, I think we span a good generational range of teams and players, and also geographically. So Doug can take South Alabama, I'll take Central Alabama, and Drew's got North Alabama. So I think we've got a good range here. Again, gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. And again, I can't thank you enough for the support you've given the X account and now on these podcasts that we're doing. So again, Doug, Drew, thank you. And I know you guys had a tiring week in Dallas last week.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Look forward to visiting with you and Drew about this.
Yeah, Mike, it's an honor to be on your show, and you've had just a cavalcade of Alabama royalty already in the first 7 episodes, and some of my favorite guys, including one of the most underrated in Alabama history, and Melvin Cheatham. I know you talked to him inside Coleman Coliseum on the floor there. That was an awesome piece you did, and I mean, there's a lot of big time Alabama basketball fans. I think it's a very underrated fan base. It's very passionate. There's a core that have been around since the 60s and the 70s when the program turned that have stayed with it. Now I guess they are the older men now, and I'm becoming one of them. I certainly started following it passionately. My first memories are '87, and '87 was one of the best teams in Alabama history. And certainly, I remember just being crestfallen when I thought that team was going to make the Final Four run this year's team made. They ran into Rick Pitino in Providence. That's well documented. But they won the SEC regular season. They won the SEC tournament, and they did what Nate Oats is doing now. And so that's kind of when I got the bug for basketball and Alabama hoops, and really high school basketball, because my father was a really good player, played on some really good teams at DAR, and he started taking me to high school games around that time. And I've basically been a hoopaholic ever since.
That's great because my reference point, Doug and I were talking about this off camera. My personal getting to see the teams up close and watch them play live started with the 81-82 team with Enos Watley. But Doug, not to make fun of you, but you precede all of us. You have a little better, longer perspective. You actually started with the CM teams. Is that not right?
My first game, I still remember it was Kentucky at Alabama at Memorial Coliseum, and Alabama had Wendell Hudson and Leon Douglas. They had Bob Andrews, and Alabama was actually ranked in the top 10 that day. Kentucky was unranked, but Kentucky came in and beat Alabama that day. And I have vivid memories of the early 70s to mid 70s, the Vanderbilt year when they beat us by 1 in Nashville and by 2 in Tuscaloosa, and then the Arizona State first NCAA tournament appearance for Alabama. They got way behind, caught up, but lost to a Lionel Hollins team, I think, for Arizona State. And then, of course, the 76 game against Indiana when Alabama had smoked North Carolina in the first round, and then ran into Kent Benson and Scott May and the Hoosiers in Baton Rouge. And I was telling you, Michael, I can almost, unfortunately, replay that game in my head. I remember it like it was yesterday.
And here's Mike.
Go
I
ahead, Drew.
apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was going to piggyback off what Doug was saying. Here's how a small world it is. I have a very keen perspective on that game because the high school basketball coach, and I've always been a stat nerd. I couldn't go to my left. I could shoot it, but I couldn't do much else. So I wasn't a good enough player in high school to make my high school basketball team, but I was a stat guy. My high school coach was Rich Valavicius, who played on that 76 Indiana team. He was the only freshman to play. He was from Gary, Indiana. He spent 2 years under Coach Knight, and then he was Sonny Smith's captain for his first 2 years at Auburn. He transferred to Auburn from Indiana, And he told me flat out in his office that Coach Knight felt like that was the best team they played on that run to the national championship and undefeated season, and quite frankly, felt like they should have lost the game. And from what I've heard in the stories, he told CM that after the game in the locker room that they were very, very fortunate to survive that foul call that Kent Benson was the beneficiary of. That I'm sure Doug can expand on. That was a late call that didn't go Alabama's way, and Alabama could have easily beaten that 1976 Indiana team.
Well, it fouled out Leon Douglas. It was a Kent Benson, Leon Douglas charge block deal, and would have fouled out Kent Benson, I believe, but it yet changed the order of the day. But don't want to get bogged down in that. But that's how far back my memory goes of Alabama basketball.
Well, the only thing I'll add on to that is, I've dug through and found video from that 76 game because I heard so much about the 76 team, and I have such respect for the players from that team, T.R. Dunn, Leon Douglas, Reggie King, all those guys. But I took that very controversial charge play from the Alabama perspective. That was a terrible call, guys. Sorry. And the official made it from half court. The guy under the goal didn't even make the call. You had an official coming from half court calling Leon for a charge. And if you watch it, Benson did not have position. His feet weren't planted, and he was going sideways. So I don't know how they made that call.
I say let's go play it. Let's get that one.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on. So, on the X account, we like to have a little fun, and we like to encourage our followers because that's what it's there for. We want feedback from the followers. That's what makes it fun. So we asked them to nominate 20 players from Alabama basketball who they thought were the greatest. And this is a very subjective or relative thing. So, people rank them different ways. Could be most talented, most accomplished, favorite, so on. So you guys, I showed you the list of 20. I want your feedback. Not anyone would you take off, but do you have 2 or 3 that you really feel that you would have liked to seen them on that top 20? Doug, we'll start with you.
Now, we're talking about players or teams?
Yes. Yeah, we're going to do players. Teams will be next. We're going to do teams after this.
Yeah, when you sent us the deal yesterday, it's so hard, to go through. And you asked, I think you actually said, give me a starting 5.
Oh, yeah. That's even harder. That
took me about 5 hours to do. But, I think the obvious ones are there. If in order, I think Watley should probably be ahead of Steele, and I think Enimo was a special player. There's some that I would change the order of. I'm not sure.
That's not order. That's just alphabetical.
Oh, that's alphabetical.
Yeah, okay. This is just generically the top 20.
Then I literally have no problem with this list.
Okay.
If you ask me who would be the first off the list, we probably aren't going to agree with all of this. But wow, that's tough. Who would you take off the list?
Well, instead of taking off, if there's anybody that you felt that should be on there, let's just do it that way. Because I agree, it's hard to take anybody off.
And I mean, I don't know how Drew feels about it, but me looking at this top 20 list alphabetically, this is a strong list, and I don't know who would go on there in replacement of some of these guys.
Well, so what we're going to do too, as part of the start of the season in about a month, we're going to take these 20 and ask the followers then to rank them 1 through 20, and then we'll count them down 20 days out. But what about you, Drew? Is there any omissions on there that you felt could have been on there? I've got 3 that I'm going to add at the end.
I want to hear them.
Yeah. What about you, Drew?
Well, I mean, one of them, and I believe I had him on my top 20. And again, I'll preface this by telling the fans, I love Robert Ory, and he was 21 on my list and could have easily been in that top 20. But Richard Hendricks was a dominant player on some good teams. They didn't do a ton of damage in the NCAA tournament. Robert's teams were better, but Richard had as good a numbers as an Alabama Post player's had in a long time, and lived up to his McDonald's All-American rating. People must need to remember he was a top 20 player in the country. He could have gone to North Carolina. He could have gone to anywhere and grew up.
I saw Richard Hendricks at the SEC tournament just this past year with his son. So
yeah, I think he was the SEC legend for Alabama, and he's doing a great job as a young broadcaster. I mean,
oh, he's outstanding. He's outstanding on the SEC network.
he's going to be a good one. He's going to continue to move up the chain, and he played a long time overseas after getting a cup of coffee in the NBA, and he comes from a great family, and so hit that kind of to me stuck out. And then another one that I think is amongst the like Melvin Cheatham, who is underrated, is Chuck Davis. And I think what hurt Chuck too is he got hurt. He was becoming a first team all SEC type guy as a senior. And unfortunately, I was in Coleman Coliseum with my cousin Janet Latham when he tore his ACL against Wofford, I believe it was, or no, Winthrop. Pardon me, I believe it was Winthrop, and Greg Marshall of all people, who he tore his ACL against. Alabama won the game, but he got injured. And people need to remember how good he was down the stretch of that Elite Eight run, because I'll tell you who fell in love with him was Rick Majerus, who is one of my favorite coaches of all time, another all-time underrated guy who recruited my high school coach, Rich Valavicius. That's Coach Val was so heavily recruited. I mean, they talk about Damon Bailey being recruited in the 8th grade. Coach Val was recruited by Bob Knight in the 8th grade, and Al McGuire recruited him, but he got to know Rick Majerus, and I know Rick loved Chuck Davis. Chuck Davis is another guy to me that probably doesn't get enough credit for how good a player he was and how well he developed under Mark Gottfried.
I just don't see who you would take off though.
It's tough though. It really is. There's there's so many great players.
I loved Melvin Cheatham from Louisiana, I believe. Loved him. Loved Chuck Davis. Loved Richard Hendricks. But you know, I don't know. I'm different, Drew and Michael. I'm not going to just pull up a stat sheet and go, okay, I'm going to pick this guy because his stats are better. I'm literally going on feel with this. So y'all can throw stats out there to kind of cancel me out with some of my picks, but I just feel like, you know, I'm going on the impact I feel they had on the program. And so that's why I love this list.
Yeah, they all did. And like we told with Michael, that's what we were saying, that there's so many great players. I don't think some of our fan base, especially the younger fans who grew up, and a lot of their when they were young kids and they were growing up and they were in elementary school and stuff, Alabama basketball was not relevant. It was mediocre. They don't understand what C.M. Newton, when he came over from Transylvania, what he built in the 1970s, late 60s through the 70s. And then the baton being handed to Wimp, what he did with the program. And at one time, in the early 90s, Alabama had the second most active NBA players next to North Carolina, not the Duke Blue Devils, not the Kansas Jayhawks, not all these blue bloods like UCLA. It was the University of Alabama, and they were turning out pros. And that's been the neatest thing to see about Nate Oats, is that has started again. I mean, Alabama didn't have a guy drafted this year. I think it's going to be a rarity. But certainly, you know, I think going in with this next year's team and how good they look on paper, Alabama is going to start churning out first-round picks on just about every year that Nate Oats is there with the way he's recruiting.
So, you know, Coach Sanderson's always told me this again. So, you know, coaches look great when you have great players. So he always understood how important recruiting was. I mean, he was a relentless recruiter when he worked for Coach Newton, and then when he took over the program.
He was really good. He was really good at hiding players the 24 hours before signing day. And then all of a sudden they show back up when it's time to sign the deal.
Hey, and that's a perfect segue for me to piggyback off with Doug, because Wimp's told me this story on his show, and it piggybacks off of my cousin Janet Latham, who was a longtime coach administrator at Athens High School. One of those guys was Keith Askins, that he definitely tried to hide. And Keith, he's not going to make the top 20, but he was one of the great role players in history. And there's not when you factor in how long he played in the NBA and being an undrafted guy with the Miami Heat, and he's still with the Heat to this day, he's like a son to Pat Riley. Keith Askins is another one of those guys that people forget how good he was.
Ultimate glue guy. And you're right. I think Coach Sanderson tried to downplay to other people how good he really was so he could steal him and get him on the team. Yeah. There's three players I'm going to throw out there. I'm not trying to take anyone off the list, and two of them I'm going more from the historical perspective. So I would always, for consideration, I would have George Lynn, the second part of the Rocket 8 with Jerry
Right.
Harper.
Right.
And then I would also go, for historical purposes, James Lindy Hood, the first All-American for Alabama, way back in the 20s and 30s. And then your all-time assist leader, one that I saw in person for 4 years, Terry Connor. Now, if I extended it to the top 25, Terry Connor would be in there, because the next five, in no order here, it was Terry Connor, Richard Hendricks, Bobby Lee Hurt, Michael Ainsley, and Charles Cleveland. So that would have been the top 25. But again, from a historical perspective, I would always throw out George Lynn and James Lindy Hood. But other than that, I can't argue with any of the ones on there. And I really think the submissions or nominations that we got were really good, because if you look at the way the decades were broken out, it was pretty well spread between 70s, 80s, 90s, and this here in the 20s. So I think we had good representation. I was really surprised how well the 70s and 80s players did.
About Bobby Lee Hurt, if he had had bigger hands, he would have been a super stud. His hands were dramatically small for his body size. And had he had bigger hands and been able to handle those post passes a little bit better, he would have probably been at a much higher level than he was, and he was already at a pretty high level.
Well, and then Michael, I'll give you my all-time starting five, because some of it, a couple of the guys are going to be from hearing things from guys like Doug, who is a great historian of Alabama basketball, being around Coach Sanderson, reading and just watching things as I do and trying to absorb information. To me, my all-time starting five, first of all, the front court it was so tough to narrow it down to a starting five, but especially the front court. I mean, it's impossible. I mean, one of my hardest decisions was trying to decide between two guys I never saw play, but I've heard so many stories, and that's Leon Douglas and Mule King, who they were back to back. They followed each other and were both great players. But I'm a position guy, so I kind of try to make them fit by position. And for me, I would have Leon in the middle. Because everything that everybody's told me is he was so game changing from the standpoint of being able to recruit him out of Colbert County High School by Coach by Wimp Sanderson as well, and CM Newton, because he was a guy even UCLA wanted. Like, he was nationally recruited. They didn't have McDonald's All-American teams back then, but he certainly would have been one. And Leon lived up to every accolade. Was a tremendous player. I would have him at the five. I would have Derek McKee at the four, even though you could say Derek McKee was like Herb Jones, kind of a positionless guy. But I would have, Derek at the four. He was SEC Player of the Year, very smart player. Let's not forget, if he hadn't gotten in trouble with the agent, he would have come back, may have been a two-time SEC Player of the Year, was a tremendous player for the Seattle Sonics for many, many years, and the best player on that 87 team. And then at the three will be my number one overall player that I've ever seen in my era to put on a uniform at Alabama. I know he only played 1 year, but it was Brandon Miller. I mean, he was absolutely electric, unguardable when he was feeling it. That's the one thing I regret with that 2023 team, is that he wasn't healthy when they were in the NCAA tournament. If he had been, it might have been a different story, because we saw what he did when he was healthy. I know against South Carolina wasn't a great team, but he had 40. He could take games over. He did in the SEC tournament, certainly when they had that rematch with A&M, and he played so well. But I would have Brandon Miller at the three. And then my guards, I'm going to go with something Doug just said. It was hard for me, because Ron Steele, when he was healthy, was tremendous and a two-time Mr. Basketball. But I know he only played 2 years, but I've heard so many things about Enos Watley, and I know he was a McDonald's All-American with Bobby Lee Hurt. I would have to go with Enos at the point. And one reason, another thing I'm going to go by is I don't remember the game. I was too young, but that they beat UCLA the day Coach Bryant died, and UCLA
That's
was
right.
UCLA. And
1983.
Yep, he was a tremendous player.
They were ranked number one.
I've got to go with Enos at the one. And guys, you know who I'm going to go with at the two. He's still playing at Alabama, but you got to put Mark Sears in that starting five with what he accomplished last year and getting Alabama to the Final Four and answering the bell each and every night. And I just think we're so blessed to see him play another year. But that would be my starting five. And then I've got to throw in a sixth man, just because I think he's as good a player and good a kid, good a person as I've ever seen at Alabama. I'd have to have Herb Jones as my sixth man. because of his defensive ability, his versatility, and just being the overall winner that he was.
So here are mine. My 1,
Yeah.
2, and 3 are the same. I got Watley at the point, Sears at the 2, Miller at the 3, Leon at the 5. Now the 4 is one that we can have fun with because I've got McKee, McDyess, and Mule King.
Yeah,
oh man, that's tough.
Pick whichever one you want. I don't care. Because Watley will get the ball to any of them, and Alabama in that lineup would have 2 guys that can penetrate, and Mark and Enamo. And then, Miller can shoot it from anywhere. McKee could shoot it from the perimeter as well. So I just don't see how you can pick 5, Michael. I just reeled off 7 names, and I didn't even get to Herb Jones.
Yeah, and I would definitely have McDyess in my top 10, no question.
Let me put you on the spot though, Doug. Out of your 4 position, give me one, because then I'll give you guys my 5.
I'm going to go with Derek McKee.
Okay. All right. So this is pretty amazing because the 3 of us all think alike, because my all-time starting 5 out of that 20 is almost a carbon copy, and the only place I differ is at the 4. So Enos Watley at the 1, Mark Sears at the 2, Brandon Miller at the 3, Leon Douglas at the 5, and I had Antonio McDyess at the 4, simply because when I saw Antonio play those 2 years, the man was just a phenomenal talent. He was so good.
I wish y'all could see this, because I literally have, and I kind of switched roles there. I have Watley, Sears, Miller, McDyess, and Douglas as my top 5, which would be your top 5.
If we had like Leon Douglas as a senior, Antonio McDyess as a sophomore, Brandon Miller as a freshman, Mark Sears as last year, Mark Sears, and Enos Watley as a sophomore, man, what damage could that team do this year?
Well, all those banners I'm seeing behind you, there would be a big one compared to the size of those other ones.
I mean, if you can imagine Antonio McDyess before, because people forget, if he hadn't hurt his knee in the NBA, I think he was on the Hall of Fame, because he was a great player. I mean, him and Nate Oats' system would be ridiculous because of how athletic he was, how he could run the floor, run it like a deer, play above the rim, protect the rim. Also was an underrated guy from 15 feet in, because he could face and shoot. He was a good free throw shooter, and he was a tough kid because he broke his nose during his time at Alabama, and it really didn't hurt his production. He was just a dominant basketball player, and they won a very spirited recruiting battle against Mississippi State to bring the native of Quitman, Mississippi, to Tuscaloosa.
Hey, Michael. So before, and I don't know where we are on time, but I want to go over these top teams because
that was my next one. That was the next thing I wanted to go
I have a little bit of a problem with one of the teams there.
Okay.
And it's going to bother both of y'all because it's in y'all's wheelhouse.
Go fire away.
I was already into my 2nd decade by the time, but it's funny. The best teams, I think we agree. I think in my mind, the team that and let me find the list that you sent me. Where are the players? Where are the teams?
Well, I forgot to send that one, but if you want to know how the followers voted, the number 1 team, it's in this order: 23 is 1, the 24 is 2, 76 is 3, 87 is 4.
That's where I want to stop you, right?
And 21 is 5. The 21 team.
I do not think the 87 team is one of the top 5 teams in Alabama.
Really?
Wow.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I absolutely do not. I mean, I lived it too, and I was there. I think we're looking at saying they're one of the greatest because, as Drew said earlier, they won both the regular season and the tournament. That team matchup problems, man. You look at, other than Connor, they had Farmer and Gottfried out there, and that was a problem defensively for those 2 guys. I think there are much more athletic teams that would drub that team, quite frankly. Don't tell Wimp I said that. But that literally, and I did see a list somewhere, but I just totally believe that 87 shouldn't be there. That's just my opinion. I was
So-
in Memorial Coliseum when they beat Florida in the Miracle game to wrap up the regular season. I was there for that game. And I don't know, that team had a lot of holes, in my opinion.
Well, let me ask this. So, of all Coach Sanderson's great teams that he had in the 80s, so would you put the 82 team, the one that got to the Sweet 16 against Michael Jordan, and also the 90 team that got to the Sweet 16 against Loyola, would you say those two might have been athletically and just talent-wise better than the 87 team?
Yes. And having
Okay.
sat down with Wimp, Wimp's sons both coached at Faulkner, where I've been or was for 20 years. So I've had off the record conversations with Wimp about the Loyola Marymount game and how he'd called all these people to define how he thought they should play. I think it haunts him today that he played that way. I think that team, if you match that team to the 87 team, I'm taking that team to beat them.
That was an athletic team. That front court was dominant that year. That was an extremely dominant front court with Ori, Cheatham, and David Benoit, who also had an 8-year NBA career under the radar.
Yeah,
all right, Drew, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that one with those three Alabama teams?
I'm glad you brought up David Benoit because it's so funny. I was growing up as a kid then, and of course, I quickly learned it was not Benoit; it was Benoit. Sounds a lot better. and then of course, one of those top 20 guys we had, who was an unknown kind of, because people forget. I'll tell a story too about when Latrell Sprewell got to Alabama. He was Latrell Spruill, but it became Sprewell quickly. Sound much better. And I've had this joke with Brian Pasick about Latrell Wright-Sell instead of Wrightsell, because Sell to me sounds a lot smoother. And we kind of joked about that. But Latrell was a guy that only played 1 year of high school basketball in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was a center. He was 6'5". He didn't even play on the perimeter. And he ended up at Three Rivers Junior College in Missouri. And then I think Gene Best was his coach. And Wimp, one thing Wimp and his staff did really well with guys like Sprewell and Benoit is they found, and of course, with they did a great job of finding junior college players that fit Alabama really well, and not just were just fits, but ended up being pros. And so I thought those two guys were amongst the great gems that they found. And that 90 team, you're right. I think they're underrated, just simply because of the regular season success and going to the Sweet 16. I love that 87 team. I mean, the way I ranked it, I had the 23 team number one because they're the best team I ever laid eyes on. That at one time they were number one in the country, and with the schedule they played and who they beat, I just felt like that was a great team. Injuries kind of derailed it, as we've already said at the end. I'd certainly had the 76 team, which I've heard so much about, that I think was good enough to win a national championship. And as Doug has told you, the NCAA tournament was smaller in those days. I believe it was, I think it was 48 teams, Doug, or was it still 32? I'd have to go back.
I don't think it was 48, Drew.
I think it was 32, yeah. And it was really regionalized. It wasn't.
It wasn't seeded like that. It was based on region. That's right.
Based on region. And so if Alabama had been in another region, they have easily made the Final Four, even though, as Doug already said, they blitzkrieged a really good North Carolina team and Phil Ford. But I would say 76 for number two. I would say number three, I went with the 21 team under Coach Oats. I really liked that team and how athletic they were and the teams they beat. And it's still that game against UCLA haunts me because I think Alabama should have won the game. They just didn't make free throws. They didn't make a few clutch plays that they had made during the regular season. And then 4 for me would be 87. And then I had to put them just because it goes back to what Doug said about not being nearly as talented. The team that made the Final Four wasn't nearly as talented, probably not in the top 15, maybe even 20 of all Alabama teams all time as far as talent goes. But I had to put them 5th just simply because they broke through and to the ceiling that all teams are shooting for, which is the Final Four. And that's why I put that 24 team in there, because they had a lot of flaws, like Doug already talked about with the 87 group. But you got to give them credit for overcoming adversity and knocking the door down, and that's why it was so cathartic for Michael to be there in Phoenix. So many former players amongst them, a lot of those 87 guys that wanted to be there to watch Alabama play on the highest level because they had so many teams, Doug, that were good enough to do it. And like that 90 team, like I agree with you. I'll never forget, I was in 8th grade when that happened. And, LMU had been blitzing everyone, including Michigan, the defending national champs, who they beat by 30. Everybody was telling me Alabama's going to lose by 30. This isn't even going to be a game. And I kept thinking, Alabama's being underrated. But I do think Doug's right. If they had at least tried to run, at times when it was opportunistic, you could slow the tempo down some. You didn't want to get into a complete running contest with them, but they should have run when it was opportunistic because that was an LMU team that didn't really defend that much. And I think Alabama, had some offensive talent that probably went underutilized in that game, and they could have easily beat that LMU team. And I don't think they would have beat Vegas in the final 8 because UNLV was a machine.
No, I don't think
They beat
so.
Duke by 30 in the national championship game, but I do think that was an Elite 8 caliber team. But there's been so many great teams at Alabama, but that's my top 5. But there's so many other great ones, and I'm glad Doug's brought up some of those.
Let me share this, and y'all will probably disagree. When I'm ranking teams in college basketball, the postseason has to carry way more weight,
right,
than the regular season does. It's really hard for me to not have in the top 3 a team that went to the Final Four. Now, I know how bad they played against Florida in Nashville. I get it. I know how bad they played toward the end of the regular season. I get it. But what they did after that erases all of that other stuff because in my mind. So I literally think 3 of the teams of the top 5, maybe with 76 in there, I had 3 Nate Oats teams. I'm with Drew. The Herb team, the Brandon Miller team, and the Mark Sears team in the top 5 with the 76 team. And I don't care who you put 5th. I'll just take the first 4 and take my chances.
So, all right. So you bring up a good point here, Doug, because again, I'm going to defer to you. By a few years, you're technically the elder statesman. I'm not too far behind you, but based on what you're saying and how you value the teams, and you have three of the top 4 all Alabama teams in your mind are under Nate Oats. So it is truly not hyperbole to say, and I've said this too, we are living in historical times above and beyond the history that was already established from the Rocket 8, from Coach Newton and Coach Sanderson. So, Doug, let me have your insight on that then, on what you are witnessing after you starting watching basketball in 73, 74.
Hey, guys, I say on my show all the time when November rolls around, and a lot of it probably has to do with the success that Alabama football has had. But you give me a basketball national championship, I will take that prior. If you told me if the sports gods came down, Drew and Michael, and said, okay, you can have 1 basketball national championship or 4 more football national championships, that's the easiest question I will have ever been asked. I'm taking basketball. And I think this group of guys with that staff and how these guys are recruiting, if they're not number 1, they're going to be number 2. Maybe Kansas is 1. I don't get that, what people that are having Kansas there. But I'm as excited about 24-25 with Alabama basketball as I've ever been.
I am too. I think it's the greatest roster I've ever seen, 1 through 13. And, I told Michael this when I was ranking the players. When I came up with a starting 5, my starting 5 was all the old men, all the 5th-year guys. And then, I had 2 McDonald's All-Americans, in Aiden Sherrill and Darion Reed in my second 5. And then I had a guy that is as talented as any player I've ever seen in the state personally that I've watched, in LeBaron Philon 11th. And trust me, from talking to his high school coach, I got a good relationship with David Armstrong, and hearing buzz from friends, from workouts and everything. I don't think it's taken LeBaron Philon long to move up from that 11th spot. And I'm not surprised because I think he's a supreme talent. He's one of the greatest players we ever had at the Huntsville City Classic. His team lost in the finals, but he was the best player. And there's no question about it. He was unguardable. And him coming over from Kansas, and it's so interesting to see to show you in putting context how high a level that Nate Oats has recruited in Alabama in 5 years. They turned down LeBaron Philon twice before he finally did flip to Alabama and get out of that letter of intent to Kansas. First, it shows how much LeBaron wanted to stay in state and play for his state university. And second, it shows what great players that Nate Oats was recruiting in this NIL era. And his style of play is unique. NBA people, basically refer to Alabama as the 31st NBA team, which I think is fascinating. And honestly, I've never really been worried about Nate Oats leaving for another school because of Greg Byrne and how he's taken care of Nate Oats. Eventually, as Jay Billis has said, it might be the NBA you have to look at. I would hope that Nate would want to continue to coach in college and take Alabama to the highest level. But if he wins a national championship, as Doug said, that'll be all worth it. And I would take definitely a basketball national championship. I've been blessed to see Alabama win football national championships in 1992, 2009, 11, 12, certainly 17 and 20, and also in 15. I've seen them win several football national championships, and I saw Nick Saban go on the greatest run I've ever seen. Now I want to see the greatest basketball run in history, and it would please me and no better than to see Alabama cut the nets down and win the Final Four. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I was as emotional as I've ever been when Alabama went to the Final Four when I watched it on television and they beat Clemson, because it was just so cathartic, because everybody always said, but, and you had to see the big banner Auburn hung up because they made a run like that and they would always hold it over Alabama. Well, we've been to the promised land. Alabama never has. Well, bow down to the king is all I can say, because Alabama has climbed the ladder, and Auburn, and hey, I'm glad Auburn's good, because Bruce Pearl's success led to Nate Oats' hiring. They feed off each other, okay? And they're both top 15 programs. Wimp and Sonny had it rolling, but now it's been taken to the elite level by Nate Oats and Bruce Pearl. I admire both guys. I think they've done a great job, and I think Nate Oats is on the cusp. If you keep chopping wood, Dan Hurley certainly did, and as you keep chopping wood, Alabama can reach the summit. They can win a national championship. And I think with this roster, if you think Nas Cunningham, and I do right now, is the 13th best player on the team, and Houston Millett is hurt, but this is a roster that has no weakness and can beat anybody in college basketball.
Here's my point about Oats, potentially NBA. And I think Nick Saban learned it in Miami. When he got to Miami and wanted Drew Brees, and the medical staff said, no, we're not getting Drew Brees, and he had to go get Culpepper, he knew right then that he was not in control of his roster. He knew right then, you're not in control of your roster. I need to be back in the college game where I can impact my roster. Nate Oats can impact his roster in college basketball. He can't do that in the NBA. You're at the, in a feeding ground where if you're good, you're not getting a good player the next year. So maybe he would want to do it just to see what it was like. But if there were ever two guys in college sports that worked together at the same time that impacted their rosters dramatically, Nick Saban and Nate Oats. Saban retired as a college coach. I'm hoping that Nate Oats retires as a college coach.
And I know we need to. And go ahead, Michael. I was just going to say I've got a final comment because I know we're getting short on time here. But for me, I'll just say this: the thing that people don't realize about Alabama basketball, because fans have worried since Nate Oats came to Tuscaloosa, well, is he going to go to Louisville, turn them down twice, Michigan twice? He could have easily been in the mix for Kentucky, didn't go there. He's turned down many an opportunity because of the best AD in my time at Alabama and Greg Byrne and taking care of him. But here's the thing, and Michael, you may have said this on previous podcasts, but people don't seem to realize the Alabama basketball job is a really good one. It's becoming an elite one under Nate Oats. But here's the history of Alabama basketball since CM Newton was hired. There's never been a coach leave Alabama for another college job. CM left to go to work for the SEC office,
That's right. Before he went to Vanderbilt.
Exactly. And Mark Godfrey left, there's but and because he knew that he had seen the end of the line, but nobody has left for another school because they wanted to go to a greener pasture. Everybody has always stayed at Alabama because it's got a really good fan base. They support basketball when it's winning, and now Nate Oats is being given every avenue to win. Wimp Sanderson, we all know how that ended. He had no. I think he would have been a lifer at Alabama. He loved the university. He's an Alabama native. Went to UNA. He had spent his whole professional career coaching at Alabama as an assistant and as a head coach. So again, Alabama is a very underrated job when it comes to stability and having good runs. And Mark Godfrey was there for a long time. But again, that's the underrated part, is that no coach has ever left for another college job. And I agree with Doug. Hopefully Nate would understand in the NBA, it's all about the players having the control. In college, it's still the college coach that can build his roster and have that control.
Well, from my perspective on a couple of things, and we always talked about, you guys touched upon it too, we always had dreamed about a Final Four, and I've been one of them, and got a chance to go. The emotions didn't hit me until I was actually in the arena and I saw them warming up for a Final Four. But I think obviously, Nate Oats runs an NBA system, but the difference, and we've already said this, it's the players, because CM built his program on in-state talent, which at the time was abundant. Coach Sanderson used the same in-state talent. Then he spread a little bit into Mississippi and Florida and got some players from here and there that augmented the program. Mark Godfrey basically did the same thing, but Nate Oats has taken this recruiting on steroids. I've never seen Alabama basketball be able to go nationwide and get prospects to come visit, to entertain the staff. So that's, to me, that's the biggest difference, is his ability to take Alabama basketball and make it a national brand like it is in football. And now you have the top recruits on. Look at all the top recruits that you have now in these last couple of years. You'll see the Alabama logo pop up when they say teams interested. Who are they interested in? Who they might get a visit? And that's something we haven't seen in decades. So to me, his ability to recruit, the people that he hires to help recruit, they are relentless on that one. And we all know you got to have the players at the end of the day. Now, you need to be able to coach them and develop them. But if you don't have the talent to begin with, you can only go so far. So I think that is the biggest difference in the current run that we're seeing, because the talent level is off the charts. And I agree with you, Drew. This year's roster, well, let me ask this. This will be my final question to both y'all. The expectations are through the roof. Good or bad? How do you feel about that, Doug? I'll start with you.
You're talking about whether they meet expectations or not?
Yeah.
Or
So fair expectations or not? Well, how do you feel?
I mean, I'll say this. They went to the Final Four last year. I would say with that roster, barring some injury misfortune, I think I would be disappointed if they didn't make a return trip to the Final Four with that roster.
I'll piggyback off and agree with Doug, especially because the one thing that I thought might not happen because of his age and because of the kind of year he had, and I thought he might just be ready to roll the dice and even take a two-way contract or have a very lucrative overseas opportunity. I knew NIL would play a factor, but I thought even with – because a lot of times it's about being hot. And the way he played Mark Sears down the stretch, I thought he might even have a chance to go to the combine and move up into the top of the second round like Herb Jones and move on. But with Mark Sears coming back and being one of the top 5 guys I've seen at Alabama and as good as any guard I've ever seen – and this is a unique time because of NIL, but being able to bring him back after that kind of year and kind of be the cherry on top of the sundae with the rest of this roster and what Nate Oats has built. And then to, on top of it, get LeBaron Philon to flip back from Kansas to stay in state and come back to Alabama. I just think this roster, I think it should be Final Four. And I think even national championship, not just getting to the Final Four, but like Nate Oats said in the post game after they lost to UConn, is to win it all. I mean, we're not satisfied just to get here and we're happy, but we want to win it. And that's what I love about Nate. He has a swagger about him. I love the way he coaches players. The way he's so upfront with him. Like, I'm going to take you out if you don't take an open shot. I don't care if you just airballed it. I have confidence in you. You're going to play at the highest level. His best trait as a coach is the confidence he instills in his players and the swagger that he has. And I just think it's infectious to the team. And I think they play with a fearless attitude, certainly. And then I think they've addressed the need defensively with Brian Adams coming in on the staff. I think it's an elite staff, and I can't wait for the first game, man. That's going to be awesome when they tip it off in early November. And I can't wait to see this team even practice. I didn't get a chance to see them practice this summer. I've heard a lot of things, and I've had friends that got to watch them work out. But I can't wait. And I got to tell you, I know they passed that rule this year with the inter squad, the scrimmages, where you can go scrimmage and you can scrimmage someone else. May have a couple of those before the season. I definitely would like to go and watch this team work, because I can't wait to see them, because I trust Nate Oats. I trust Ryan Pannone and Preston Murphy and now Brian Adams. This is an elite staff, as Doug said, and I think their aspiration should be to be the last team standing in March, and they're not going to shy away from that.
And Michael,
I agree on that. Oh, go ahead, Doug.
It's certainly, in talking about I'm taking you out if you pass up a shot. I think Stevenson is the face of, I don't care if you airball a shot.
Oh, yeah.
It. So we saw that in the NCAA tournament play out right before our eyes.
Right. And I don't even have him in my starting five. That's how good it is to be.
Yeah.
Right now. But it's definitely an abundance of riches. Guys, the time has flown. I know, Doug, you've got a show to prepare for. So, again, I thank you both for squeezing in time this morning to do this. And this is everything I thought it was going to be. This has been great conversation, great things to think about, and only just, I don't know, makes the anticipation more for early November when they tip it off against UNC Asheville and Coleman Coliseum. So, again, honor, guys. Thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate you having me on your shows this last winter. And, man, I can't wait to hear the conversations you guys have later this winter for Alabama basketball.
Thanks for including me, bro.
Thank you, Brian. Right, Michael. We look forward to having you back again and getting Doug on with us, too. It's been an honor to be with you guys today.
Oh, anytime, guys. When basketball season rolls around, if I'm free and you want some meaningless conversation, call me up. I'll be glad to do that with both you guys.
I'm always looking for a meaningless conversation.
All right, guys. Take care. Thank you.